Thousand Autumns, is a Meng Xi Shi novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 128. Banbu Peak was still that Banbu Peak. For 100,000 years it had stood here, the rise and ebb of human histories, dynasties cycling, it was not affected in the slightest. On account of yesterday's rain, the clouds overcast the sun, on the river swirls of condensation rose into fog, even the adjacent Yinghui Peak was enshrouded in white cloud, inadvertently a celestial landscape. The people in the landscape had no mind to savor the scene, did not have any illusions about having ascended. With the many days of rain, the rocky path was unusually slippery, combined with Yinghui Peak's vertical rise, anyone standing at its base looking up would be forced to inhale sharply, never mind speak of climbing it, it would be akin to treading on thin ice. Even the martial arts practitioners with Qinggong and Nili were forced to walk slower than usual. After all, today's Yinghui Peak was the site of a grand occasion. On any other day the path belonged to the occasional woodcutter or wandering poet. Today there was an intermittent stream of Jianghu people equipped with their weapons ascending the mountain. The path up the mountain was not man-made, merely worn down from the steps of previous travelers over time. Where there were scant human traces, there would be a vertical cut in the cliff face like a knife, a straight drop, nowhere for a body to stand. Only those with exceptional Qinggong could continue onwards. Those with average Wuzhong were forced to stop here, and only sigh as their gaze fell upwards. It could be described from the base to the peak there were 9 extremely treacherous segments. These 9 segments would serve as an authenticity test to anyone's Wuzhong. As for the number of people who could reach the peak, they could be counted on one hand, so the ones able to watch the fight from Yinghui Peak were even fewer. Many people had traversed more than 1,000 li to get here, for the sole purpose of witnessing this monumental peak battle, even if for a few colonels to brag to their children later. How could they bear just standing at the base of the mountain? Therefore, no matter how treacherous the climb, many were still willing to make the attempt, step by step along the path. Brother, if this Yinghui Peak is so difficult to ascend, why don't we try Banbu Peak? Isn't Yan Wushi and Hulagu fighting on Banbu Peak anyways? Even if we reach the peak here, we'd have to observe the fight from across the river. It wouldn't be nearly as clear as watching from Banbu Peak, and the fog is so heavy today. The one speaking was Kuiji Wang's Wangzhou. On the day of Shijiandawai, he'd nearly been injured by Duan Vinyang and had been rescued by Gu Hengbo. Youth had no immunity against beautiful woman, and Wang Sanlang was no exception. He secretly admired Gu Hengbo in his heart, and wanted to make the connection, but he didn't count on Gu Hengbo ignoring him. At the end of Shijiandawai she had chased after the departing Yuan Xiao. Wang Erlang couldn't stand to see his brother wallowing around all day. When he heard of the match between these two grandmasters at Banbu Peak, he had brought his brother along to watch the match. Although the two of them were talents among the new generation in the Jianghu with uncommonly good Wuzhong, faced with Yinghui Peak's 9 treacherous segments, they were ultimately stuck at the last one. In front of them, there were no stairs, just a sheer rock wall. The vertical rise exceeded 3 zhang, that is to say, if you wanted to reach the peak you had to jump over this cliff face. There was nowhere in the middle to pause. On account of last night's rains, the loose rock collapsing, this cliff face was even more slippery and smooth. There was no other option besides jumping over it in one go. The two Wang brothers stared at this cliff face. There were 7 or 8 others who were similarly stuck at this segment. They'd all been set on watching the fight from the top. They'd all passed the previous 8 segments, and now were stuck here. Wang Erlang gave his brother a look. Do you think everyone else is dumb? If Banbu Peak was a easier climb than here, everyone would be there already. Why would they be here? It's said that the top of Banbu Peak is only a square con in size. It would be a feat to stand there. To be able to exchange moves, the fighters must be extraordinary. What other space would be left to observers? Wang Sanlang, dumbstruck, then what should we do? We've come such a long way, but can only stand here. He squinted in the direction of Banbu Peak. He gave an exasperated sigh when he realized his view was completely obstructed by this rock face. Even if he stretched his neck, he'd only be able to see a stretch of white cloud, never mind the figures on the mountain. Faced with this scenario, Wang Erlang had also been caught by surprise. He said kindly, "Now you realize, outside of people you know, there's more people, outside of your patch of sky, there's more sky." Just now Chaniangwan's Li Shaoxia and Su Shaoxia, they were able to go up. Wang Sanlang thought of Gu Hengbo, turned even more gloomy. They must have started already on Banbu Peak. I wonder what the situation is. Wang Erlang also really wanted to know, including the two of them. The 10 of them looked around at each other. Some were not ready yet to give up, wanted to make another attempt. Taking a breath, they jumped, their body rising vertically in the air like a heron opening its wings, a wild goose mid-flight, extremely graceful. 10 pairs of eyes were fixed upon that person. They saw that the highest point of the other's jump was more than halfway up the cliff face, but by then the other had ran out of steam. He had to alight on the rock, intending to push off it, but beneath his feet it was slippery beyond compare. There was no way to maneuver around it. His body began to fall. Despite exerting himself to his limit, there was no way to go any higher. He was forced to come back down. This person, coming short in front of the crowd, was a little awkward. "My skills are unrefined, apologies for the scene." If any of the others could go up, they wouldn't be standing around. They all reassured him, "You're being too humble, your Qinggong is already very good, it's just that it rained last night, so the path is even more treacherous than usual, otherwise we'd all be up there already." Everyone commiserated, and chatted a bit more. Wang Erlang asked, "The two of us just got here, how many people have been able to go up?" Someone responded, "Not many, but also not too few. Ruyan Gongju, Yi Guanzu, Du and Vinyang, these masters we don't need to mention. There were also a few from the younger generation that went up. I recognized Li Qingyu, Su Qiao, and Cs Yang, but not the other." Someone else added, "I recognized him, it was Chixia Jianpai Chaoyu." Wang Erlang was surprised. He'd fought Chaoyu before, the other had been a notch behind. Who knew Chaoyu could also jump up from here? It was clear that he was inferior to him in this aspect. At this moment, another person made an attempt to jump up, with the same conclusion and descent. Everyone was very discouraged. It's now close to Chen Shi, a Shishan has passed, the fight has probably long started. Has the outcome been decided? As I see it, it's better to go wait for news at the base of the mountain, better than being stuck here unable to go up or down. This made sense, but with just one last segment in their way, who could bear giving up now? The one who had just tried jumping sighed, I can only blame myself for thinking Qinggong was useless, didn't focus on it, and now I'm stuck here, this is so upsetting." Before his words trailed off, he made a sound of surprise. "Look, another person is coming, I wonder if he'll be able to get here." Everyone turned to look. Indeed, there was a human form approaching, at breakneck speed. A blink, and he was right before them. The Wang brothers recognized this newcomer. They cried out, "Shen Daozan." Shen Qiao didn't realize when his name had gone from Shen Daozang to Shen Daozan. He had no mind to dwell on it. All he cared about right now was the match on Banbu Peak, so even though he recognized the Wang brothers, he only nodded his head, and had no intention of having a conversation. Of the 10 people here, half of them recognized Shen Qiao from Ch128, the other half didn't. They hadn't been in attendance then, but even if they didn't, hearing the unmistakable Shen Daoist, they would have known who Shen Qiao was. Of the other half of the people there, the look they were giving Shen Qiao instantly changed into one of awe and respect. Wang Sanlang, seeing that Shen Qiao's steps hadn't slowed, and was about to continue on his way, out of reflex called out to stop him, "Shen Daoist, please wait." A furrow appeared in Shen Qiao's brow, but he did stop, turned back to look at him. Wang Sanlang, hesitating, "Can I ask if Shen Daoist has seen his Shimei recently?" "Hengbo." Shen Qiao shook his head, "I have not seen her since Ch128." Wang Sanlang, hearing this, could not hide his disappointment. "Shen Qiao, are you wanting to go up?" Wang Sanlang was a bit embarrassed. "Yes, but this rock face is too high, nowhere to step in the middle, so." Shen Qiao looked at it, and said, "I can bring you along." Wang Sanlang, "Ah." "Shen Qiao, are you coming?" Wang Erlang was faster to react, accepted the offer. Yes, thank you Shen Daoist. It's just that we are 2 people, I'm afraid that you'll have to make 2 trips. Shen Qiao, "No matter." Wang Erlang didn't know what he meant by no matter, just felt his shoulder grasped tightly by a hand. Before he could react, his vision blurred, his feet left the ground, Wang Erlang felt himself lifted entirely like a parcel. Shen Qiao, with a person in each hand, without pausing halfway, directly ascended the rock face. Not only the Wang brothers, but everyone watching the 3 of them vanish from their field of view, were all rendered speechless, no words came out. They had seen Li Qingyu and the rest jump up from here, their Qinggong was good, but if you had them bring 2 people along with them, they might not be able to do it, hence it was clear how exceptional Shen Qiao's Qinggong was. They were all stunned, some were sad and regretful, they regretted not having been able to speak up, so that Shen Daoist could have brought them along too. After a long time, someone finally sighed a long sigh, "Outside of people you know, there's more people, outside of your patch of sky, there's more sky, Shen Qiao is already so powerful, what realm has Yan Wushi and Hulagu reached? I realize there's no need for me to watch this match, I ought to go home and cultivate a couple more years and then see." Saying this, shaking his head, he made his way down the mountain gloomy and forlorn. The people left were not nearly as pessimistic, but they had similarly received a slap to the face by Shen Qiao's demonstration. After passing this segment, there were no more overtly difficult segments. Shen Qiao said to the 2 of them, "I'm going on ahead, you won't be late even if you follow slowly." Wang Erlang hurried to say, "Thank you Shen Daoist for your help, the remaining part we can do on our own, after you." Shen Qiao nodded, sped up his footsteps, in a moment, he'd reached the top. At the moment there were several people already standing at the top. Shen Qiao took a brief glance, and recognized several familiar faces. Everyone was entirely focused on watching the 2 figures on the adjacent Banbu peak, they hadn't yet registered Shen Qiao's arrival. With respect to distance, Banbu Peak and Yinghui Peak were not that far apart, but on account of the river running between them, the 2 peaks were divided. Fog continued to swirl and enshroud, but the mountain wind was piercing, dissipating the fog intermittently. Needless to say, the people able to reach the top, their wuzhong and eyesight must be first-rate, so it was not difficult for them to see clearly the situation on the opposing peak. Shen Qiao had no time for small talk with the others. As soon as he arrived, his attention was drawn completely to the other side. Yan Wushi and Hulagu, the 2 of them, neither held any weapon in hand, yet in the space between every move, every exchange, robes billowing, sleeves flying, perhaps it was the cut of the mountain wind, or the surging of Genki, that entire mountain of fog was being dissipated by their exchange, giving the observers on Yinghui Peak a clear view of the match. By the time Shen Qiao arrived, the two of them had been fighting close to a Shishin. Looking at them, it appeared no one had any intention of drawing things to a conclusion. In between palm strikes landing, boulders cracked, mist dispersed, the force so strong, it could be heard clearly on this side. As a martial master, and as someone who had entered the realm of the Grandmasters, Shen Qiao soon realized, these two were holding nothing back. If they continued this way, there was no way it would end in a enough, but an until death outcome. If Shen Qiao could realize this, Ruyan Ky, Yi Baikan, and the others beside him naturally could realize this as well. On Yinghui Peak, the wind howling, robes in an erratic dance, Cs Yang, and the rest of the masters from the younger generation were forced to circulate their qi to steady their balance. On the opposite Banbu Peak there was even scanter vegetation, the wind was even more fierce, but for Yan Wushi and Hulagu, they were not affected in the slightest. The wind roared around them, but was drawn instead by their Genki, taking on the form of a cyclone, with the two of them as the center, subjugating that which had been unyielding. Cs Yang was quick to speak, was not able to hold things in like Li Qingyu could. Witnessing this, he couldn't help but ask his Shifu, Shizun, as you seen it, who has a greater chance of winning? He didn't say who would win, just whose chance of winning was greater. It meant he also saw the situation as an impasse, uncertain, intractable. Ruyan Ky intentionally tested his disciple, asked him instead, who do you think? Cs Yang furrowed his brow in thought for a long time, then said, it's probably Hulagu. Ruyan Ky, why? Cs Yang, these two are both extraordinary martial masters, although it's not clear right now who is superior, but with respect to the depth of Nili, it should be Hulagu that comes out ahead. Because Duan Vinyang was also present, Ruyan Ky wasn't willing to make any self-deprecating remarks to inflate the other's ego, so he didn't say anything, but in his heart, he did not necessarily think this way. It was true that Yan Wushi was extremely powerful, his reputation well known, but Hulagu was Hulagu. He was able to on King Qinchin defeat Yi Baikan as easily as splitting apart bamboo. To achieve this feat of strength, Yan Wushi likely wasn't quite there, so in this fight, although to outsiders may look uncertain, but to them at their level of martial arts mastery, the conclusion may have started to reveal itself from the very beginning. Although they didn't like Yan Wushi, they still lived within the same Central Plains Wulin. If he lost, it would be a huge blemish on the Central Plains Wulin, so Ruyan Ky and the others naturally hoped that he would win this fight. Even if the likelihood was not great, but at least it was not zero. Needless to say, everyone watching each had their own views, but the two that were on Banbu Peak were immersed in their own scenery. Hulagu had not crossed paths with Yan Wushi previously, but before the fight, his disciple Duan Vinyang had amassed every piece of information relevant to Yan Wushi. Hulagu also knew that the man was arrogant. Back then, when his Wuzhong had yet to reach any pinnacle, he had dared to challenge Kui Youwang and Qi Fengge. To send him a challenge letter now then, was not that out of character. He was devoted to the path of martial arts, so to be able to cross paths with a worthy opponent, he considered it a very good thing. Banbu Peak, jagged rock formations, strange vegetation and growths, the area available to stand on was no larger than a square kun. It might fit 3 people sitting cross-legged, but if you wanted to fight in this space against the strong headwinds, it would be a sincere test of your gongli. Both sides fought with no embellishments or extra flair. After starting, it was hard edge grading against hard edge. Hulagu had trained with numerous weapons, had incorporated the might of these weapons into his hands. Every move, every strike contained the form of various swords, sabers, long spears. His movements had the semblance of toppling mountains and turning seas, as if it were the oceans raining down, its crashing waves, oppressive and controlling, intending to trap Yan Wushi. Currently, strong winds surged from every direction, directed by Hulagu's Nyili, surrounding Yan Wushi. Inch by inch it tore apart the Genki defenses the other had set up, roaring, it intended to tear that person apart completely. Between heaven and earth, as if only one person remained, Yan Wushi's Nyili was strong, but he had no way of resisting the will of heaven and earth. At some point his Nyili would run out. At that point Hulagu's offensive would surge forwards, leaving no chance for escape. It looked like the winds combined with Nyili had trapped Yan Wushi entirely. If he wanted to advance or retreat half a step he'd feel its pressure and would not be able to cross it. But if he was that easily defeated, then he wouldn't be Yan Wushi. The headwinds cutting in every erratic direction, from the southeast, then northwest, the peak was entirely open to the elements, meaning the wind was ceaseless. Where there was gain there was loss. This was the logic of the universe. If Hulagu wanted to borrow the might of the headwinds, he would have to expend more Nyili for it to happen. Yan Wushi was at a disadvantage, but not a ripple crossed his face. His feet had not moved. He closed his eyes slowly, channeling his entire body's Nyili at once, forming a barrier, temporarily halting Hulagu's offensive. But facing Hulagu, this kind of weak defense would not last long, merely buying a moment. Soon the barrier would disperse and his entire body would succumb to the onslaught of air striking in every direction, and he would die a mutilated corpse. Yan Wushi did not need that long. The reason he closed his eyes just now was to hear more carefully the course of the headwinds. Heaven and earth did not conform, the headwinds too could not be predicted, but human maneuvers left behind traces. No matter how much Hulagu wanted to be one with heaven and earth, ultimately he could not achieve a perfect merger. There would be an opening. A moment was enough. Yan Wushi opened his eyes suddenly, a palm strike aimed at Hulagu. This was followed immediately by his form leaping into the air, another palm outstretched. The impasse had been resolved. Not only that, he had gone from the defensive to the offensive. During the duration of a Shishin in their fight, Hulagu had come to appreciate his opponent's wheeliness. He hadn't counted on being able to beat Yan Wushi with this one move, so he was not surprised. His sleeves flew outward, his body floated back, landing on a single pine needle, his presence rendered nil, blowing in the wind. But this was enough for him to launch himself again several jong into the air, his form hidden in the white fog, almost like encountering a ghost. Naturally it was no ghost. Hulagu utilized the blind spots in people's field of vision to mislead his opponent. Combined with his extraordinary speed, no trace could be seen. He was able to create this illusion for the people watching, in broad daylight, no need for the cover of night. This level of skill was enough to terrify everyone. The people watching couldn't stop the slight grimace from showing on their faces. Some people had already started to speculate, if it was them encountering such a scenario, whether they'd be able to overcome it. No need to mention the Wang brothers. As for Li Qingyu, Cs Yang, and the rest, these young people, talented and smart, a little proud, asking themselves sincerely, they knew that if it was them in this scenario right now, 8-9 times out of 10 they would have no way of resolving it. How many years before I can enter the same realm as Yan Wushi and Hulagu? This question, at this moment, drifted into many people's thoughts. Yan Wushi had not moved. Because he knew moving was futile, the other's speed was fast enough to mislead everyone's eyes, so if he tried to pursue the other, it would be a waste of his energy. It was clear to Yan Wushi, the moment the other finally stopped, would be the moment Hulagu struck out in full force. So he chose stillness as movement. His hands that were hidden in his sleeves began to mobilize his nyuli, amassing genki. A lifetime's cultivation would meet in the next strike. Hulagu had been prepared to strike first, but he discovered something that shocked him. Yan Wushi had no opening. A person's Wuzhong, no matter how high, even if they had reached the realm of all-encompassing all-tolerance, would still have an opening. All life forms, trees, and living things, people, nothing could be flawless. Yan Wushi was also no exception. Hulagu understood, the reason the other had no opening was because he could not discover his opening, and not because the other had achieved perfection, existing on the same plane as the heavens. He was astonished to find, this person's resolve, manner, cunning, was more impressive than Chi Feng's from back then. With time, he might as well achieve something great, breaking open the upper limits of martial arts cultivation, a direct ascent into the heavens. This kind of ascension had nothing to do with death and the soul, it was more or an awareness of the logic of the heavens, catching a glimpse of the end marvel of the chaotic universe. Hulagu had trained for decades, along his way he had lost to Chi Fenga, was willing to wander the outskirts for more than 20 years, he had never been short on patience, but here facing Yan Wushi, he couldn't help but feel a sliver of envy rise from the depths of his heart. Yes, envy. The other was younger than him, his caliber was not necessarily higher, but he had a chance in breaking open the limits of martial arts cultivation. Just this stroke of luck alone was not something everyone had a claim to. To be human was to be jealous. Hulagu was not a celestial, he could be as well, but this minuscule twinge of jealousy he quickly tossed into the back of his mind. He decided to strike. Hulagu's 5 fingers were defined but not overtly fair. From Taju, as well as being a martial artist, his hands had the usual calluses, and were a bit darker in places. But this pair of hands contained the force of heavy thunder, the huge strength that would instantly stun a crowd. Sleeves billowing on account of the surging genki, he closed his 5 fingers, like gentle waters resolving in an instant into an icy, jagged knife point, he struck towards Yan Wushi's head. Almost at the same time, Yan Wushi jumped, turning in mid-air, meeting Hulagu's palm strike head-on. Strength meeting strength, one was bound to become the weaker one. Hulagu recognized Yan Wushi's potential, he also recognized, when he was Yan Wushi's age, he had not achieved his level, but this did not mean he would concede defeat and let the other win. They both knew, the two of them crossing paths, even if wasn't today, sooner or later, the day would arrive. After Chi Fenga, in the world there was only Yan Wushi who was worthy of being Hulagu's opponent. They were like old rivals, today's fight would end with death. Their auras met, genki exploding in every direction, in an instant trees ruptured, boulders flew, the noise of the collision, even the fog-filled sky could not avoid it in time, the fog dispersing in the wind. As for the two of them, their bodies were protected by the barrier of their coalesced genki, rock particles and dust could not get near. Everyone held their breath watching this moment. It was merely an instant. The opposing colossal genki collided in mid-air, Hulagu drifted to the ground, Yan Wushi retreated slightly, then landed. Wang Sanlang felt tongue-tied, unable to utter half a sentence, he tugged on his brother's sleeve once, finally spat out a few words, "This is Hulagu's victory." Wang Erlang did not reply, his gaze remained on Banbu Peak, unable to shift in the slightest. The others watching, were mostly like this. Hulagu and Yan Wushi, they were mere inches apart, standing across from each other, looking at each other, from a distance, they resembled more friends meeting after a long parting than opponents locked in a life and death struggle. Could it be that it was not over yet? As soon as he had this thought, Hulagu moved. He used a speed unimaginable to Wang Sanlang to lunge at Yan Wushi, and the latter seemed to have anticipated the other's move. Both sides lunged at each other. In an instant a dozen more moves were exchanged. Hulagu had incorporated a decade's worth of saber training into his palm style. The fierce aura was like a saber's edge, wildly surging, swallowing, nothing held back as it crashed towards Yan Wushi. Yan Wushi suddenly smiled. From this all-encompassing, immaculate palm style, he saw a hint of an opening that had been well concealed by Hulagu. Maybe it was a remnant of something left behind by Qi Fengge 20 years ago, maybe it was that this time he felt rushed, or maybe he was just eager to defeat Yan Wushi. Regardless, it was something Yan Wushi was happy to notice. He remembered the words Shen Qiao had said to him previously. Hulagu was highly skilled in the use of many weapons, incorporating it all into his palm style, for the purpose of perfecting it, but close to perfection did not mean flawless. All things in the world were imperfect. He suddenly extended one finger. The other's aura had transformed into 10,000 forms, but he only extended one finger. This one finger was pointed directly at the other. Hulagu's expression changed. He realized that Yan Wushi had found his opening. Faster than can be described, Hulagu's palm aura had already landed on Yan Wushi, and Yan Wushi's finger, which similarly had coalesced a decade's worth of experience, like splitting bamboo, landed directly over the other's heart. The sound of a huge explosion, Hulagu was flung backwards. He reacted in time to grab hold of a branch, was able to pull himself back, landing heavily on a boulder. He spat out a huge mouthful of fresh blood. His face went from purple to white, almost transparent. In contrast, Yan Wushi was still standing there, having not moved. Just his outstretched hand from earlier fell forward weakly, trembling. "You win." Hulagu spat out blood with every word uttered. With every mouthful of blood lost, his complexion worsened. Yan Wushi still had not moved. Hulagu's gaze had drifted from him to the unhurried clouds overhead, the deep blue sky. His lifetime's regret was not that he couldn't help to conquer the central plains, was not his loss against Qi Fengge, then Yan Wushi, but that now he could advance no further on the path of martial arts. After death, if reincarnation exists, maybe in the next life he'll have another chance to chase after the pinnacle of martial arts cultivation. He slowly closed his eyes. Hulagu is dead. Wang Sanlang faltered. He looked at Yan Wushi, his gaze seemed to be stuck there. It appears so. Yan Zongju. Wang Erlang's tone was a little hesitant, because he had no way of knowing how Yan Wushi was. No one brought up the idea of departing from the mountain. It was like they had not quite yet recovered from that fight. Ruyan Ky and Yi Baikan were still for a long time, as if they were realizing something remarkable and unspeakable. Yu Shenjun, however, was extremely worried. He felt for sure his Shizun was injured, but the distance was too great. He couldn't stretch out a hand. If it were to wait until he ran down the mountain and then back up Banbu Peak, who knew how much time would be wasted? The situation didn't allow him to think further. He turned his head intending to head down the mountain, but his shoulder was held back by a hand. Yu Shenjun looked back. It was Shen Qiao. "Shendaozang. I'll go." Shen Qiao only said these two words. In the next moment, Yu Shenjun had opened his eyes wide, disbelieving. Because Shen Qiao made a movement that no one could have expected. He broke off a branch from a nearby tree, then cast it into the air. The tree branch had been infused with Nyali and flew a large distance. Shen Qiao rose in the air. With one breath he jumped in the direction of the tree branch, his form drifting at ease, as if he were one of the celestials. Shen Qiao intended to jump from here to Banbu Peak. How was that possible? Wang Sanlang was dumbstruck. It was true that the two peaks were not that far apart, but no matter how remarkable your Qinggong, to cross this kind of distance, it was a little forced, and there was nowhere to pause in the middle. If you weren't careful and fell, what awaited was a 10,000 zhang drop, then the relentless river waters. He suddenly realized what purpose the branch Shen Qiao cast out served. The other's Qinggong was unparalleled. In the Jianghu it would be hard to find a close rival, but also no one had attempted to jump from Yinghui Peak to Banbu Peak, with the river in between. Truly it was to risk your life. Shen Qiao was now drifting in mid-air, approaching his limit. His body began to sink. Wang Sanlang's heart also dropped. But Shen Qiao did not lose his footing. He had superb control of his position. This dip, he was able to step solidly onto that tree branch. Borrowing its force, he flew up again, drifted towards the opposite side. That tree branch, after being stepped on, lost its forward momentum, descended rapidly. Everyone was staring in a daze at Shen Qiao's departing form. Even Ruyan Ky and the rest had stunned expressions. It was so out of the norm. Wang Sanlang's gaze had gone from one of awe to one of worship. Shen Qiao ignored everyone's reactions. His attention was solely on Yan Wushi. How strong was Hulagu, and he was dead. How would Yan Wushi be unscathed? With the Wang brothers' observation skills, they might have no way of knowing, but Shen Qiao saw it clearly at a glance. Yan Wushi was not only not unscathed, his condition would not be much better than Hulagu's. However, he didn't expect that just as he landed on Banbu Peak, he'd have to catch the other's collapsing body. Yan Wushi. Shen Qiao's expression changed. He was holding onto him and could only feel a rush of ice. Yan Wushi's eyes were squeezed shut, expressionless. From the corner of his mouth there oozed a dark red, dripping down his chin. Shen Qiao didn't say anything, just rummaged for his medicine jar, poured out several capsules, carefully fed it to the other, then placed a hand on his meridians. On examination, although he was prepared, the devastation still hit him as if his internal organs were being crushed. Yuan Kai exhausted, yang loss apparent, all signs point to withering, no chance for survival. No chance for survival. In that moment, Shen Qiao's face took on the same hue as Hulagu's. His hands began to shake. He forced down his agitation. From his robes he took out another bottle of medicine, poured out almost all of its contents, as if to make him swallow it all at once. On learning of the occasion of the fight, Shen Qiao had prepared these medicines. He had purposefully sought out Suan Dushan's multigenerational remedies for severe injuries, just in case, but he had hoped he wouldn't have to use them. Don't overdo things, what remained of Shen Qiao's logic reminded him. He forced himself to take a deep breath, counted out 3 tablets, and fed them to the other. After a long while, Yan Wushi's complexion still had not improved in the slightest. Shen Qiao's heart was a field of ice. He was supporting the other's head, but his own body had gone numb. He was kneeling, the pebbles grinding through his robes into his knee. He did not feel the pain at all. Shen Qiao tightly held onto Yan Wushi's wrist, the force so great it looked like he wanted to crush the other's wrist. The wind howled in all directions around them. The people gathered on Yinghui Peak had not yet dispersed, but all of this had no way of diverting Shen Qiao's attention. He closed his eyes, hoping that everything before him was a dream. When he opened his eyes again, that see the world as a plaything, insufferably arrogant person was still lying in his arms, eyes closed, life at a close. He had never known that grief and pain in its extreme, his heart crushed, would feel like this. Yan Wushi, Shen Qiao, his voice coarse, whispered next to his ear, if you wake up. If you can wake up, I'll do anything you want, even if it's just to tell me, all this was another setup to deceive me. Shen Qiao couldn't continue, he was shocked to realize that the other had held such a heavy weight in his heart. This weight exceeded 1,000 pounds, heavier than he could bear. His body shaking, he lowered his head, and slowly pressed his lips to the other's cheek, forehead, then in a gentle caress, he buried his face into the other's neck. The fabric of the robe collar slowly became wet, Yan Wushi moved slightly. He suspected that it had been a false sensation, he didn't even have the courage to lift his head. Then in the next moment, the other's weak voice reached his ears, "Did you just say, you'll do anything?" End of the chapter and end of the novel. Stay tuned for more extra.